So I'd first like to thank the conference organizers and sponsors for this wonderful opportunity and inviting me here to give this keynote speech. I'm deeply honored to be asked to do this. Okay, so I can see that I've monkeyed around with the title a little bit. It's not quite what was on the posters here, but I'm an economist, and I have spent the better part of the last 25 years trying to understand the economic impact of sports on local economies. Now, most of my research focuses on professional sports in the United States, but I will try to generalize some of the lessons I think we've learned to a setting like here in Korea. Okay, so here's the outline of my talk today. I'll talk in general about local economic development policy and sports. I'll talk about the experience we've had in the United States, where a much larger country than Korea, we have done an astounding amount of building of new professional sports facilities over the last 50 years, and we have also spent a lot of government taxpayer money to subsidize that. I'll talk about why I think and why the evidence shows that subsidizing sports is not an effective local economic development policy. And then I'll wrap up with some concluding remarks. Now, I'm not giving an academic talk here, but I want to emphasize that everything I talk about in terms of economic outcomes and sports subsidies is backed up by research published in peer-reviewed economics and public policy and sport management journals. So this is not my opinion. This is evidence-based information that I think should inform economic policy in terms of sports and local economic development. Okay, so I want to talk first about, we need to think about the role that sports plays in the urban economy and how cities' economies function, because in the United States and in Korea, the big top-level professional sports teams are going to play in cities. So the very nature of cities has changed over the last 50 years. At one time, cities existed because they were centers of production. Jobs were there. Detroit, Michigan was the center of automobile manufacturing in the United States. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was the center of the steel industry in the United States. And these are these cities as centers of production. But over the last few decades, cities around the world have changed. And now the reason cities exist and the reason cities are vital and attract people is that they are centers of consumption. Cities are places where residents have a wide variety of consumption activities they can undertake, cultural activities, restaurants, bars, sporting events. All of those things, those consumption activities, are why people want to move to cities and live in cities in the modern economy. So that's driving in migration, are these cultural amenities that consumers so much like. Sports, especially sports played at the highest level of competition, is an important cultural, urban consumption amenity, because if you want to see a football match played by one of the best football clubs in your country, you're going to have to go to a city to see that take place. You're not going to see that somewhere out in the countryside. Many local decision makers also view professional sports teams and the facilities where they play as important local economic development projects for whatever reason. Because those projects are often viewed as important economic development projects, it's important to go back and assess what actually has happened in the past when cities have engaged in economic development projects based on sport. Okay, so, I mean, we know how to undertake successful local economic development projects. There's a huge number of them that have occurred in the United States in the past. You know, for example, we know that the Moving to Opportunity program That was a program in the 1990s in the U.S. Which provided housing vouchers for low-income families to move to neighborhoods where there would be higher incomes. That program was tremendously successful, evidence shows, because 20 years later, the people who participated in that program, which was a randomized controlled trial, just like the sort of research that takes place when we figure out if medicines are successful, those people had substantially improved economic outcomes over their lifetime. So that's a local economic development project. Provide housing assistance to low-income households. We know that works. In the United States, we've created enterprise zones. Those are basically tax credits that are given to businesses and individuals in specific neighborhoods. That's a local economic development project. The evidence is mixed, but in general, it shows that they were successful in sort of revitalizing neighborhoods. And that's just tax credits, right? Some specific examples would include the Cincinnati Innovation District. That's anchored by a university in the U.S. city of Cincinnati. It focused very clearly on startup businesses and creating jobs. It's a highly successful program. The number of new businesses that innovation district has spun off is large, and the jobs that are created there are quite high paying. There's a Syracuse Center State Corporation for Economic Opportunity and what they call the Syracuse Surge. That's a workforce development policy where they're trying to make sure that local businesses have access to the educated employees that they need. It's been highly successful, right? So these are all viable and successful and proven local economic development policies. I just want to point out that they focus on things like affordable housing or policies that enable the creation of innovation or growth and jobs and those sort of things. So we know how to do it. My talk is about why in the United States, we've decided that professional sports that played at the highest level is also a viable local economic development project. Okay. These sports-related projects, they're really viable. Some examples that I can think of: build a new stadium and attract a team, right? Host a mega event like the Olympic Games or the World Cup. Host a Formula One auto race. These are the sort of local economic development policies that we see cities around the world engage in. They're popular because they're really visible, right? Doing something like the Moving to Opportunity program, for example, was not visible at all. Nobody knew it was going on. So it's hard for a politician to stand up and take credit and say, look what I did. I gave housing vouchers to low-income households. And 30 years later, they're way much better off than they would have been absent that. But if you're hosting a Formula One race, or if you're the host of the Olympic Games, that's really visible, right? It's high profile. You're on television around the world. So in general, any successful local economic development project has to have one of three sources, I would say. One is you've either got to have tourism in your city that wouldn't have occurred elsewise, absent that sport. You've got to attract new residents, or not on my slide, but I think three, you've got to provide more human capital and education to your local residents so they can become more productive and earn higher wages and get good jobs, right? Those three things have to happen. So what are the downsides of sport-led local economic development projects? Well, one, they're really expensive. I mean, the amount of investment you have to undertake to host the Olympic Games is enormous compared to, a startup-focused, university-linked program or providing housing vouchers to low-income households, right? The second, which I will talk about a bit later in the talk, is unlike some of those other programs, professional sports generate negative externalities in the urban economy, and by that I mean crowding and traffic and crime and reduced air quality and enhanced transmission of airborne viruses. There's evidence that shows all those things go right along with attracting a new team to your city and building a facility. Okay, let's I'm going to review the experience over the last 50 years in the United States. In the U.S., state and local governments, starting in about 1970, went on a huge binge of professional sports facility subsidization for the new construction of new facilities. So over that period, there were 133 new facilities, and that's just facilities for the top 4 professional leagues in the U.S. The Major League Baseball, the National Football League, the National Basketball Association, and the NHL. The total direct subsidization for those 133 new facilities was $35 billion. That's about $266 million per facility. That's not construction cost, that's public subsidy, that's taxpayer dollars. The average public share was about 64%. So in addition to those direct subsidies, as an economist, I need to think about the indirect subsidies that go along with this. And that's the fact that the bonds issued to pay for these new facilities, they are tax exempt under US tax law. And that means they're going to carry a lower interest rate than they would if they were privately issued bonds. The estimates there are about an additional $4.3 billion in foregone federal tax revenues because governments are issuing these bonds. So this has provided economists in the United States with this really rich environment in which to study the economic impact of these sport-led local economic development policies. Let me just graphically display this a little bit. So this is 1970 to 2020. This is the total. The higher up is the measured on the vertical axis is the dollars in millions that went to the subsidy of these new facilities. Every S is a new stadium. Every A is a new arena. The horizontal line is that average of $266 million. So you can see that these new facility construction projects were pretty sparse in the 70s and 80s, but starting about in 1990, you see all of a sudden those A's and S's start getting really thick. And the other thing that we can see is after 1990, if you drew a trend line through those points, it would be going up. So the dollar value of subsidization for these projects went up substantially. If we express this in percentage terms, you can, so now this is just what the total subsidy was as a fraction of the total costs. A couple of things stand out. First, the subsidy fraction is pretty high throughout the period, but there are a lot of S's and A's down there at 0. That means, in fact, it is possible for sports teams to finance and build their own new stadiums and arenas. But there are also a lot of S's and A's up there at 1. That means, or close to 1, and that means those were almost entirely publicly financed. The subsidy percentage was 90%, 80% to 100%. And you can see the other thing, if we think back to that last graph, total costs are going up, so this implies that total subsidies are going up. And so every one of those S's and A's is a new sports facility, stadium, or arena. Economists look at that and see that as an experiment. We can look at what happened in these cities before and after those new facilities were built. That's what my research has been about, and a lot of other economists who work in this area. That before and after comparison, where we can see what actually happened in the local economy. Right. So why are these bad local economic development policies? Well, one is the evidence shows strongly that they're completely ineffective. That is, they don't actually generate any tangible new economic benefits in the local economy. That's not to say there's not a lot of spending that goes on in those facilities. There are. I don't dispute that. I've been to games. We all have, right? But the key insight behind this research is that spending that's going on in and around a stadium or arena is mostly local spending, consumption spending that would have occurred somewhere else in the city at some other time if we didn't subsidize these stadiums and arenas. Now, Another claim to justify these projects is, especially hosting the Olympics or hosting the World Cup or attracting a professional sports team to your city, is that it generates intangible benefits. That is, civic pride, right? That Seoul can be a world-class city because it was a host of the Olympic Games, right? That argument gets gets made frequently. There's evidence about that I'll talk about. There's claims that tourism is going to increase because of hosting a mega event or attracting a professional sports team to your city. Well, I mean, the evidence again does not really bear this claim up if we look at it carefully, and the reason is cities are already tourist destinations, and that means people are going to visit Seoul not because they want to go to the Olympic Games or because they want to see a KBL game, but because it has a rich variety of consumer amenities and cultural amenities that consumers like. So, yeah, do people travel to go to the Olympic Games? Yes, absolutely. Don't dispute that. But all those visitors coming into Seoul, the evidence suggests, are just renting the hotel rooms and buying the meals and taking the cab rides that another set of tourists who would have come to Seoul anyway if the Olympic Games weren't there. So if you would rather have a lot of sports-focused tourists instead of a lot of tourists that are traveling for another reason, that's great. Do you need to spend the amount of money that it takes to host the Olympic Games in order to do that? And is that a good policy? Not clear to me. It's bad because, again, these negative local externalities, which I'm going to talk about, that often people don't think about when they're thinking about a sports-led local economic development policy. You don't think traffic's already bad in Seoul, right? And during the Olympic Games, it was probably a lot worse, or it's probably a lot worse on game days at highly attended sporting events. And then finally, it's important to recognize that these are public policies that have important opportunity costs. So opportunity cost is an economic concept. It basically means it's what the next most highly valued activity you could have undertaken with the money you used to host the Olympic Games, right? And it's difficult to pin down an exact place that we might find opportunity costs, but cities face unlimited demands of their residents in terms of they want public services provided, transportation, education, public health, right? And every dollar spent subsidizing some sort of sports project is a dollar that you can't spend on education or public health or hospitals or those sort of publicly provided goods that we all find desirable. So again, those are all backed up by evidence. Another reason they're ineffective, again, is there's 30 years of peer-reviewed research that has uniformly failed to uncover a single instance where a sports-led local economic development project led to large, tangible economic impacts in terms of increased jobs, higher wages, higher tax revenues, higher incomes, whatever it is you want to talk about. And there's a ton of research on this. And that research uses a whole lot of different data at the city level, microeconomic data at the individual level, firm level data, administrative data from governments. There's just been a ton of empirical approaches that researchers have used to generate this evidence. Most of it, again, exploits the opening of a new facility. But if sports are really important drivers of local economic growth, think about this thought experiment, which I published a paper on once. In 2004, the National Hockey League had a labor dispute between the players' union and the league, and they canceled an entire season worth of NHL games. None were played, right? So I went back and looked at what happened to those economies in cities that were host to NHL games, and what happened was nothing. The economies moved right on along as if nothing happened, even though there were no NHL games played. That's that would seem, that strongly supports this idea that people spend money at hockey games. If they don't spend them there, the local residents are going to spend money in the local economy on something else. They're going to go to the movies, right? They're going to eat out more at restaurants, something like that. Local consumer spending is just going to be spent somewhere else at some other time. Now, I will put a caveat on this. This broad literature, in general, lacks any causal inference methods, which is something that's taken over economics in the last 10 years, where we look for things that look like natural experiments, or would, the natural experiment for stadiums and arenas would be to randomly assign a new stadium or arena to cities across the country and then look at the before and after comparison. Can't do that, but we look for, economists like to look for settings that sort of resemble that. And then I'll also put this caveat: the evidence shows no statistical effect. Just because we can't detect it doesn't mean there's not some economic impact going on there. It may be there are methods or our data are not good enough, but when you got 30 years worth of evidence, it tends to be pretty convincing to people who are researchers in this area. So, again, successful economic development policies either attract new people to the city or attract new tourists who wouldn't have come to a city otherwise. There's no evidence that building a new sports facility is positively associated with migration into a city. So it's not attracting new residents. The evidence from the hospitality industry indicates a minimal impact of sports on tourism, even for mega events. Why? As again, I've already mentioned this, cities are already major tourist destinations because of their other amenities. And tourists that are attracted by sports displace tourists who would have visited the city for other reasons. I did a really detailed study of hotel occupancy in Los Angeles, California, around the Staples Center, which is the most heavily utilized arena in the United States. It's home to 4 professional sports teams. There was no difference in hotel occupancy rates on game days or before game days and times when no games were played. Why? Because Los Angeles is already a tourist destination, and those hotel rooms are already full. So, sports, we can think about a stadium or arena as a consumption amenity, and economics tells us that consumption amenities, the value of them, might be capitalized into nearby property values, right? You think about a consumption amenity like a park, and property values tend to be higher near parks. Why? Because it's people value in an urban setting having green space, and that's an amenity, and it gets capitalized in those housing values. So there's been a tremendous amount of economic research that has looked at what the impact of new stadiums and arenas are on nearby property values. Here the evidence is pretty mixed. Some papers find that property values are higher near these facilities, other find lower. I've written a paper that looks at what happened when NBA teams left cities in the United States, and property values went up near the arenas when those teams left. Why? Probably because of the negative externalities, probably because traffic got better after there were no NBA games. So let's give this literature the benefit of the doubt and say, all right, well, suppose that these consumption amenities are capitalized into housing prices and they're higher. I think the first one thinking about that in terms of the public policy is a policy that makes homes more expensive really a desirable economic policy? Housing affordability is already a huge problem in cities. I know people in Seoul here certainly know that, right? So should we really undertake a public policy that's going to make housing even more expensive for residents? That's a tough call. I don't think we hear, that very much in the overall debate about these policies. So economics does tell us that, well, yeah, it's going to be good for real estate developers because they're going to make a lot higher profits out of the increased values of those properties near the facilities. If you're an existing homeowner, yeah, that's good for you too, right? But if you're a renter, or if you're a low-income household in a neighborhood where it's getting a new stadium or arena, it's not good for you, especially because you're not going to be able to capitalize on a lot of the jobs that are going to be created in the service industry. So even if there are some negative aspects to the consequences of those policies for property values. Now, there is good, and the evidence is consistent with this idea that a new sports facility can concentrate economic activity in and around the stadiums and arenas on game day. And that's going to be good for businesses that are nearby those facilities, right? And so, of course, if as a matter of local public economic policy, you'd like to move economic activity around in your city, well, so be it. I mean, that's certainly going to be able to accomplish something. Now, if you're a business owner somewhere outside of the impact area and you're losing customers because they're going to the stadium, you're not going to be very happy about that, right? But that's basically what the evidence shows that these economic development policies can do, right? There's certainly evidence that employment and wages in consumption-related businesses like restaurants or bars or retail establishments near these facilities do go up, right? So, but this again takes business away from restaurants and bars located in other parts of the area. Yeah, winners and losers, not an unambiguously positive thing coming out of this economic development policy, unlike some of these other economic development policies I've already discussed. And then we get to the very bad. That is a growing literature that uses very good data and modern causal inference methods that looks at these congestion externalities. So every one of these negative externalities has one or more peer-reviewed papers supporting it, right? So hosting a professional sporting events in a city causes local crime and local spending on policing to go up, right? Because large crowds of people at professional sporting events are attractive to criminals. Because you know that you've got a big concentration of high-income people, they can afford to go to these games. In a rather surprising but robust line of research, local domestic violence goes up in cities that are home to professional sports teams because of unexpected losses. And there's evidence that happens in a lot of sports, the NFL and the NBA in the United States in particular. So if you didn't, and this is local, this isn't countrywide, it's in a city or in a county. Local traffic congestion increases substantially because of professional sporting events in the United States. Local airborne particulate matter increases. So if you build a new arena or stadium, basically the first thing you do is dig an enormous hole in the ground. And you've got to have a large number of trucks carrying that soil out, and that puts all sorts of particulate matter into the air. That's not good for local health. And another thing is that in our post-pandemic era, as we've understood the importance of airborne transmitted viruses, there's evidence in a number of papers that seasonal influenza and the spread of the novel coronavirus were enhanced by sporting events because you're putting a lot of people in proximity to one another, and those viruses are airborne. So you're going to have cities with professional sports teams have higher seasonal influenza mortality. That's peer-reviewed research. So all of those negative externalities, giving low-income households housing vouchers doesn't generate any of those things, right? So it's important to balance out when we're doing a full cost-benefit analysis, these costs and these benefits of these programs. All right, so what about world-class city status? Seoul has been a city that's hosted a number of mega events, high-profile events. And I'm sure that it did a lot for the civic pride here in Seoul to be an Olympic host. I'm sure that hosting the World Cup matches did a lot for civic pride and providing Seoul as having a reputation as a world-class city. Those things are valuable, right? There's been a lot of economic research that have tried to put a dollar value on civic pride or a sense of community or world-class city status or those sort of things that would be conferred on a city because of a mega event or professional sports. They're important, but all the estimates in this literature are nowhere close to that $266 million public subsidy on average that we put up in the United States for the construction of new facilities. Now, much of this research is what economists call stated preference research. That is, they're case studies based on survey data, and they have pretty small samples. So, but despite those limitations, it's consistently, what are you going to get out of a new stadium and a football team in your city? It's about $40 million present discounted value on average. That's nowhere, again, close to that $266 million average subsidy. So it's important, but it can't justify the sort of spending we've done in the United States on these things. So what about the impacts on public health? So they had a huge campaign in London, in England, associated with the 2012 Summer Games that they hosted, that they said, well, hosting the Olympic Games is going to help Britons become much more physically active. And they're going to exercise more because they're going to see, because they're going to see everybody participating in the Olympic Games and realize, hey, I should go for a walk. Well, there's evidence that looked at rates of physical activity in England before and after that, and they were the same. It did nothing to increase physical activity in England. And there's also no evidence that having a new professional sports team in your city makes people more physically active. So, I mean, that's not to say that there aren't some people who become more physically active, and becoming more physically active is shown to generate health benefits. There's probably a lot better ways to do that than spending $250 million on a new arena in your city. There's probably a lot of much more effective grassroots policies if the goal is to get people to become more physically active, which I think we'd all agree is an important public health goal. All right, so what about the mega events? The Olympics, World Cup, World Championships, they clearly attract large numbers of tourists. Nobody disputes that. But here's the problem with mega events. The IOC and FIFA, who decide who's going to host those events, they basically force cities to compete with one another in order to gain the rights to host those events. And the way cities compete is by promising to build larger and more lavish facilities to hold the games in. That leaves cities with a legacy of white elephant venues that are much too large for what their local population really needs. I mean, the classic example of this, well, there's two. One is Athens, which the city was basically bankrupted by the 2004 Olympic bid and games, and the other is Rio in Brazil for the World Cup and the Olympics. I mean, some of those World Cup stadiums they built in Brazil were later turned into bus stations. Why? Because the local team drew 2,000 people and the stadium seated 40,000. That's what the bidding that the IOC and the FIFA set up leads to happen. Now, there are now a trend towards bids, looking favorably on bids that would reuse facilities that are already existing. To the extent that that happens, this is going to be mitigated, but it remains to be seen if that's the way that they're going to continue to operate. After all, the World Cup in Qatar built a huge number of very large stadiums, and they're way too big for the Qatari sports leagues. Another important thing is that there's often local infrastructure upgrades that are associated with these mega events. They built a subway in Athens. It wasn't there. That's great. And they upgraded the airport infrastructure in Brazil. you know, that's perfect. But if you really need your transportation infrastructure built, increased, you should do that, and you shouldn't need to host the Olympic Games in order to get it done. It should be a policy that local economic decision makers are willing to take. Okay, so summing up here, overall assessment. Sports can increase intangibles like civic pride, world-class city status, and those things are valuable. And sports, especially professional sports and mega events, are very effective in concentrating economic activity. That means that you can revitalize specific areas and affect regional growth. But it's also important to bear in mind that economists call policies that advantage one area and at the expense of other areas a place-based policy. And there's really little justification for employing place-based policies in economic theory. So why is that? Because most models of spatial economic activity assume that people sort themselves into where they want to live in a way that maximizes their own utility. If everybody's already has the same level of happiness no matter where they live, why should you move those people around? These projects are expensive with significant opportunity costs for cities and regions. They're not going to generate tangible new local economic benefits. They're not going to generate significant new tourism, and they entail a lot of negative economic externalities. So what are some lessons that can be learned from this? From the perspective of the national government, I think that one lesson is that the national government should focus on broad-based sports-related policies that affect all residents. And understand that these place-based policies that focus on a single area or region often have negative impacts on other areas. That is this displacement effect that I've been talking about. For local government, prioritize policies that can effectively increase your economic development, and recognize the limited ability of sport to drive local economic development. Learn from those mistakes we've been making in the U.S. for 50 years. There's a lot of local economic development policies not related to sport that are worthy of carrying out. For industries and sports industry organization, recognize that government subsidies entail opportunity costs to other parts of the economy. If you're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a new sports stadium, then those dollars could have been spent elsewhere on education or public health or safety. Sports industry organizations should develop sustainable financial models that would eliminate or reduce at least their need for government subsidies. We saw that a lot of stadiums and arenas in the United States have zero public financing and are 100% paid for by the teams. Those are worthy policies that sports industry organizations should focus on. And then businesses should recognize that sports concentrates economic activity, and these displacement effects are really important. They're going to move economic activity around. Sports-led local economic development project could lead to reduced revenues for a business if they lose customers to the new sports facility. And so it's not unambiguously positive across all businesses in the city, these policies.